Hello and welcome everybody to this colloquium, which is a joint enterprise this time between Oxford's Institute for Ethics in AI and Oxford's Philosophy, Law and Politics program. My name is John Tesiulis and I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. And it's a pleasure to welcome my co-host this evening, who is Professor Ruth Chang, Oxford's Chair of Jurisprudence. The book that we are going to be discussing this evening is System Error, subtitle Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot, which is a powerful critique of the moral limitations of the ruling Silicon Valley ideology by three authors, Rob Reich, Mehran Sahami, and Jeremy Weinstein, who as Stanford professors work in the heart of Silicon Valley. So it'll be interesting to find out if writing the book has had an impact on their social invitations. The key message of the book is that the potentially transformative effects of digital technology on society are not a matter of fate, preordained and unalterable, but rather they're a matter for successive human choices, both individual choices and collective choices. Currently, the authors claim these choices are overwhelmingly made by engineers and by venture capitalists whose optimizing mindset, their obsession with scale, damages values that either are not taken into account in this optimizing process or which are relatively immune to the logic of optimization. The positive message of the book is the need to democratize the making of these consequential choices, to substitute, as the authors put it, the messy, inefficient, yet empowering logic of democracy for the blinkered technocratic governance by coders and powerful tech companies. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, who will introduce our three authors. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, John. We're completely, utterly delighted to have with us all the way from sunny Palo Alto, our three visitors. First is Rob Reich. I first met Rob when we were both giving talks at a public festival in Italy, and we blew off some steam by taking out one of those go-karts that are powered by pedaling around an ancient walled city and repeatedly crashing whenever Rob was driving. Anyway, Rob is an amazingly broad thinker, a real jack of all trades. He's professor of political science and by courtesy, professor of philosophy at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. He directs the Center for Ethics in Society and helps direct both the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society and the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, which puts on really great webinars that I recommend to everyone here. He's written or co-edited many fascinating books, including Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, and books on education, such as Bridging Liberalism and Multiculturalism in American Education, and Education, Justice, and Democracy. His next book is a volume with themes relevant to our discussion today. It's called, I think maybe tentatively, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, and it's co-edited by one of our commentators today. Mehran Sahami is the James and Eleanor Chesebro Professor in the School of Engineering and Professor and Associate Chair for Education in the Computer Science Department at Stanford. He comes to Stanford after a gig at Google, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he is the reason that Stanford's computer science undergraduate major has exploded, and in a way is responsible, for good or for ill, for educating a large chunk of the folks who now work in Silicon Valley. He has chaired or co-chaired several task forces concerned with the teaching of computer science, both domestically and internationally. And California Governor Jerry Brown appointed him to the state's Computer Science Strategic Implementation Plan Advisory Panel. He's also one of the nicest and gentlest intellectuals you will ever meet, so I'm really looking forward to his contributions to the session. Our final visitor is Jeremy Weinstein. I can't say anything personal about him because this is the first time I'm meeting him, but he's just as interesting an academic as Rob and Mehran. Jeremy is professor of political science, Fisher Family Director of Stanford Global Studies, and senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. He's also a faculty co-director of the Immigration Policy Lab and the Data for Development Initiative. In addition, he's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. He's author of Inside Rebellion, The Politics of Insurgent Violence, and co-author of Co-Ethnicity, Diversity and the Dilemmas of Collective Action, both of which are award-winning books. We're really looking forward to a great session. Before turning the floor over to our visitors, who will start off our session by giving us a short summary of their book, I want to remind our audience here that we will be having a Q&A session. So if you have any questions at any point during the session, please put them in the chat. I'm now turning the floor over to Jeremy.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction, John and Ruth. I feel jealous that I've never had the opportunity to be in the pedal bike with you, Ruth. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity to do that in person sometime soon, maybe on the narrow streets of Oxford, if we can get past the pandemic. I'm going to share my slides just to get us started. And we are going to tag team the three of us and offer you a perspective on why we wrote the book, what the book is about, and how we think about some of the opportunities for change, as John described, for democratizing control over the technological choices that will determine our future. But I want to start with this slide, which is something that will help situate you in the moment that we experienced on the Stanford campus. About a decade ago, which was a transformation in the undergraduate student population. Stanford is the seedbed of Silicon Valley, and it really began to affect the way in which undergraduates at Stanford were thinking about their own career trajectories, an absolute revolution in students thinking about what professional paths to pursue. And at the time, we saw an absolutely enormous growth in the number of students who were choosing to major in computer science, the most popular major for male undergraduates, for female undergraduates. And this was a trend that existed across a set of major institutions in the United States, but was maybe centered in some ways at Stanford. What were those students leaving behind? Well, most of them were leaving behind the social sciences, leaving behind fields like economics and psychology and political science, but also leaving behind the humanities. And this was a part of a cultural moment on campus in which, recognizing the superpowers that exist in the hands of programmers and coders, there was a sense among Stanford's undergraduates that you could do good for the world and get extraordinarily wealthy at the same time by joining this transformative engine of economic development and political change that was Silicon Valley. And at the time, you began to have sort of, publications like the New Yorker, you have a headline on the right, beginning to call Stanford Get Rich U. And part of those stories were reflecting on the fact that not only was there this extraordinarily successful training ground and seedbed for young technologists, but venture capitalists and others were organizing themselves around Stanford. And so if you went to Stanford as an undergraduate, you could develop the technological skills that you needed, and you'd have a paved pathway into the world of sort of tech startups. Now, we came along, the three of us, one of us having built this pipeline, that's Mehran, as Ruth described, the most popular professor on campus teaching computer science, and Rob and I, who were looking at our empty classrooms and wondering where had all the students gone. And we confronted a moment in which people were beginning to realize that the optimism that existed around the potential for tech to do good in the world was gradually being challenged by an emerging pessimism about technology and its potential harms. Some of this was a consequence of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and election interference in the 2016 election, but a recognition that the products that were being built weren't just win-win-win for everyone, but that there were people who benefited and there were people who were potentially harmed, and that maybe there had been too many blinders around the eyes of those who were building the technologies and those who were running the companies to their potential harms. And so the three of us worked together with Hillary Cohen, who's also pictured here, to say we have got to bring about a cultural change on campus where our superpower technologists recognize the privilege that they have to deploy these tools in the world, but also the responsibility that they have to think not only about the transformative benefits for society, but also the potential harms. And the way in which the exercise of building technology is something that fundamentally encodes a set of values, and that refereeing the value trade-offs that might be embedded in new technologies is probably not something that is only the job of technologists themselves. So we began to teach undergraduates, about 300 students a year, in a required computer science ethics course that we brought together both technical perspectives on these challenges, but also a perspective that comes from philosophical and normative questions, and then my own background as a social scientist and someone who's worked in the policy domain. And what we found in doing this work is that there was an appetite not only at Stanford, but also more broadly to engage in these questions. And so we began to teach during the day, but also at night to professional engineers, something that we continue to do today. And over the course of the pandemic, with the kind of material that was coming to fruition, we decided to put pen to paper and to write a book, because ultimately, as John said at the outset, our fundamental view is that democratic politics is the arena in which so many of the value tensions that are essential to the debates around big tech, democratic politics is where they need to be refereed. And there's no way for us to be refereeing those trade-offs unless we develop a deeper shared understanding as citizens about what's at stake. So let me tell you a bit about the diagnosis in the book. If you read the newspapers at the current moment, you would think that fundamentally the challenge in big tech is a challenge that is rooted in the behavior of particular individuals who are at the top of these companies. Think about Elizabeth Holmes, the Stanford dropout, Bad Blood, the book about the Theranos scandal, or the concern and attention that's paid to Jack Dorsey at Twitter or Mark Zuckerberg. But our view is that we're at a moment where the externalities associated with the decisions made in big tech, consequences that everyone experiences regardless of whether you're a user of big tech, are driven not by the behavior of single individuals, but by three fundamental drivers that have created a situation in which each new technological frontier produces extraordinary benefits, but also important social consequences. And we expect that pattern to continue, regardless of who's in the leadership of tech companies, for three key reasons. The first, and Rob will go more in depth on this, is what we call the optimization mindset of technologists, that the operating code of computer scientists and the orientation that they bring to both product design, but also to the building of companies, is one that is structured around a framework of optimization. And Rob will talk about the challenges of that framework and why we think that's an insufficient framework when it comes to developing technologies that help us build the kind of future that we want. The second is that when you combine that optimization mindset of technologists that blinds people to potential harms of technologies, when you combine that with the structure and ecosystem of venture capital, which incentivizes companies to scale technologies quickly and to begin to dominate markets so that venture capitalists can realize that quick return, companies begin to own a particular space and dominate it so they can be bought up by other larger companies, you end up taking problems that might have been visible early for a small number of people, and you turn them into social harms that become major policy issues that are difficult to address. And the third piece of the puzzle is that the optimization mindset and the venture capitalist obsession with scale is driving the growth of these technologies, and it's been met, at least for the last 25 years in Washington, D.C., by regulatory indifference. And we date the beginnings of this regulatory indifference to the Clinton-Gore administration and the strategic decisions of the Clinton-Gore administration to build a regulatory oasis around big tech. With that, let me pass it to Rob.
All right, so the basic premise both of our teaching and then in the book is the idea that the operating system of big tech in Silicon Valley is broken. And as John introduced the book, the decisions of a very small number of people who sit within the big tech companies are encoding a set of values. And then as those technologies roll out, those values get imposed upon the rest of us. We're going to say a little bit more than we typically do in a short presentation about the first of the diagnoses that Jeremy just gave, the optimization mindset, mindful of the fact that we're here hosted by an ethics and AI center, very exciting to be in an audience with lots of people with both technical and philosophical backgrounds. So, you know, on the face of it, of course, optimization sounds like a wonderful thing. Who could be against it? And we want to acknowledge, of course, that applied within a particular narrow technical domain, optimizing a solution to a particular computationally tractable or defined problem is indeed a powerful theoretical or intellectual advance. But we try to show how the ordinary person doesn't need to understand all the details of a technology. No one needs to become an expert in artificial intelligence or machine learning in order to take stock of and exercise their own agency over technology itself. Rather, you need to understand this optimization mindset of the technologist. So Jeremy, if you go to the next slide, I'll just say a few things about each of these problems. The first one for anybody with philosophical training is not difficult to discern. It's that optimization is, of course, only a means to accomplish some other end or goal. And from a moral standpoint, we have to pay at least as much attention to the independent worthiness of the goal we're trying to solve for or optimize, not simply commit ourselves to an obsession about a means to accomplish it. So to say it quite bluntly, if you optimize for a bad end, you make the world worse, not better. And the kind of overwhelming obsession with optimization amongst technologists, you know, which is embedded already in the earliest of their courses in the computer science department, tends, in our view, to lead them to pay far more attention to the means for solving problems than to considering and evaluating the worthiness of the problem being solved or the objective being solved for. And finally, note, of course, that many technologies have dual purposes, good and bad use cases. So optimizing as an all-encompassing approach will not allow us to take stock of those. Next slide. The second problem is one that's also familiar to any economist, which is that when we set for ourselves a genuinely worthy and large goal so that we've effectively avoided the first of the problems of optimization, we nevertheless need to get a quantifiable measure, or what's often is called representational adequacy of what we're trying to optimize for. Of course, we need something computationally tractable. And when you set for yourself an extraordinarily large goal, say something like happiness or safety or connecting people, you need some proxies, you need some metrics. And those metrics are often quite distant from the thing we actually care about. Not everything that's valuable can be reduced to a quantifiable measure. And the proxies that we often set for ourselves are inadequate to the genuine value of the goal we try to solve for. So Jeremy, if you go to the next slide, I'll just give a quick illustration of this. Facebook's mission statement is to connect the world. And here is a famous and infamous memo circulated by a vice president about how they try to measure their progress toward that goal. The measure is simply connecting people on the platform, the number of people on the platform, growth metrics about what's happening, including, of course, engagement metrics. And the ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect more people is often de facto good. There's an example of where the metric gets in the way of the actual independent goal that we're trying to pursue, namely connecting people everywhere. Growth is not a way to track that genuinely worthy goal. Next slide, Jeremy, it will be the third of the problems of optimization. And here, if you optimize for one good end in a broader social dynamic, optimizing for one end can threaten the social balance of other valuable goals. And we illustrate this with a admittedly somewhat trivial kind of story. The next slide, Jeremy, is the story about Soylent. Soylent is a meal replacement powder. we try to suggest that the engineers who came up with this meal replacement powder provided it in a way that does indeed optimize for the body's nutritional needs. The engineers who created this have a fantastically interesting story to tell about how they realized that food is an inefficient vehicle for delivering the body's nutritional needs. Far better to optimize for the body's nutritional needs through this powder. Of course, we care about food for many other reasons than just the nutritional value. It's a social connection. It's a cultural identity. It brings us great pleasure. And a world in which we optimize just for one of these ends, say through Soylent, denies or upsets the broader values that we attach to food as well. So that's a story about optimization. And I'll just finish this by saying, when you have this hammer, everything becomes a nail. One of the things that we observe in Silicon Valley is that technology so obsesses over optimization that it becomes a mindset to view the entire world. Here are the ways in which the computer scientist is often taught about optimization. And the next slide suggests then that everything in the world is then viewed as an optimization problem. That suggests things like the ways in which we pay attention to all of the decisions we make in our lives. Next slide, Jeremy. We're optimizing our sleep. We're trying to evolve algorithms that guide us in all the decisions we make about dating, about raising our children. You can even optimize your trash can. And I'll end this just by saying, or sharing an anecdote in which I had been invited to a small salon dinner in Silicon Valley. The people around us said that the topic of discussion was to evaluate what it would mean to find some place on Earth that we could maximize the progress of science and technology. The conversation sort of proceeded with great enthusiasm for this idea. People said that it had already begun to spec it out in various ways. Cautiously, I sort of got into the conversation midway through and asked, I can't figure out what the governance arrangements are here. Is this a democracy we're talking about? And the immediate response from most people around the table was that absolutely not. Democracy is slow. It holds progress back. This has to be a benevolent technocracy. So when the optimizers come to assess our political systems, they see a slow, inefficient, suboptimal institutional arrangement, and therefore don't appreciate and have any fundamental attachment to democracy itself in the extreme. Okay. Next slide, Jeremy. I want to spend just a few minutes before I turn the floor over to Mehran to talk then about how we view the value tensions. Well, we described at the start how technologists encode various values and make various value trade-offs in the products and technologies that we make. And we have 4 separate chapters that try to specify the value trade-offs that have been imposed upon the rest of us by the small number of technologists in the big tech companies, chiefly here in Silicon Valley. The first is one that anyone who's been paying attention to AI and ethics has already heard much about, namely problems with algorithmic bias and fairness, and we could add to it issues of explainability and due process and transparency. So the extraordinary era of powerful AI ML models with big data pumped into them that give us extraordinary means for predictions and inferences about humans run into rival values of insisting upon fairness, anti-discrimination, explainability, and due process. The decisions about how to strike these value trade-offs, again, being made chiefly now by a small number of people and companies imposed upon the rest of us. Next slide. We're familiar with the basic business model of so many tech companies. They're data maximalists, scooping up as many data points as they can about our various behaviors online and offline, threatening various values of individual privacy. Shoshana Zuboff's book about the age of surveillance capitalism is a very detailed diagnosis of this basic political economy. But I want to add here that when we think about the value of privacy itself, we can also think of technologists who have built extraordinarily technologically advanced mechanisms for guaranteeing privacy and gone all in on just that value itself. So if you have on your phone WhatsApp or Signal, You have an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform that cares only about privacy. And when rival values of personal safety or national security arise, the technologists who have created these systems give no ground at all to the worthiness of those ends and simply offer up privacy as the only value worth caring about. So in this respect, we're looking once again at the optimizing minds of the technologists in two different directions. One that's a total violation of our privacy by scooping up every data point that they can, or alternatively, a 100% commitment to privacy itself through end-to-end encryption. Next slide. There's a chapter, of course, on automation and the effects that automation are having on human beings. And we try to show not only about the familiar stats about technological displacement of labor and the various ways that that's happening quite rapidly, but also the ways that automation is transforming the experience of work, not just displacing workers. And we try to cash this out by looking at the potential benefits that are gained from automation, productivity benefits, efficiency benefits, as against metrics of human well-being, both human agency and human material welfare. As we're arriving in the dawning age of a metaverse universe, or at least the arrival of multiple metaverses, I think questions about virtual and augmented reality and human agency itself will again come to the fore as yet another value trade-off worth paying attention to. Fourth and finally, there's the familiar trade-offs on online social networks about commitments to freedom of speech, and then the informational health of democratic societies. An all-in commitment to freedom of expression online, of course, means the massive amplification of misinformation and disinformation, various forms of hate speech as well that threaten individual dignity and undermine the conditions of a healthy informational or digital public sphere that democracy relies upon. And so once more, we point to the value trade-offs that are struck chiefly by a small number of people, Mark Zuckerberg being the sole dictator of the informational environment of nearly 4 billion people on Facebook, far too much power for anyone, however enlightened, to wield. These are the value trade-offs we put at the fore. And again, the very idea of value trade-offs we think runs up against the optimization mindset of the technologist, who is far more comfortable in a world where they can get the absolutely best outcome. But in a world of value trade-offs where we're considering these social externalities of the technologies themselves, we tend to find ourselves in a world of better and worse answers, not singularly correct answers. And this again bumps up against that optimizing impulse. So to give you a little preview of some of the answers or solutions we try to steward, returning to the ground of democracy, I'll turn the floor over to Mehran.
Thanks, Rob. I'll briefly try to take you through some of the directions we think of in terms of solutions for this problem. First of all, is that we sound a very hopeful note. The fact that technology should not be thought of as just a wave that washes over us, that we have no agency or any control over. But really, we need to bring our values to the fore, as Rob was talking about, and have those values infused more into technology. And so we can think about some of the ways that that might happen. One of the first, if we go to the next slide, is to think about the effects of technology being ours to shape. That means first we need to have an opinion. We need to think about what the value trade-offs are that are involved in each of these situations might be, where we stand on them, and then voice that opinion, whether it be through the democratic process or through other processes of informing others, taking part in civic functions. But the effect of technology, really, we have agency over. And if we give up our control of technology to a small number of companies and don't participate in the process by which they can potentially be regulated, or by which other values can be infused into that technology, then we give up our agency. And we think that would be the most tragic outcome. If we move to the next slide, we can get a sense for the way Silicon Valley frames this problem. And the issue is that oftentimes there's a libertarian view in the technology sector. The idea is that you're given a choice as an individual, whether or not you want to, say, use an application or delete it, whether or not you want to make individual choices about your browser settings for privacy, or the particular settings you use in an application, things like your cookie preferences, which we now see pop up all over the place. But what this does is it puts the onus on you as an individual to have to make these choices. And it's framed for you as a way that you still have freedom, but in some sense, it doesn't really impact the larger ecosystem if you personally decide to use Facebook or not. The other issue that comes up is even if you as an individual choose not to engage with some of this technology, it doesn't mean that you avoid the larger ecosystem of problems that are actually taking place as a result of the externalities generated by this technology. You might choose not to participate in social media, but that doesn't mean that social media doesn't still have an impact on the democratic sphere in terms of election misinformation and disinformation that then downstream you have to deal with because of who gets elected in the particular locale that you're in. So if we move to the next slide, the way that we think about these things are they're systematic problems. As a result, they require systematic solutions, not just the choice of a particular individual with respect to using a particular piece of technology. We liken this to the roadway system. When you think slightly over 100 years ago with the advent of cars, initially there weren't systems in place for automotive technology. The idea was you could either drive a car if you had the means or not drive. And if you drove, good luck, try to be safe out there. And the idea was that people would just have their own personal agency. The problem is when you have a bunch of people making just those individual choices, what you ended up getting were road accidents. You had loss of life because we didn't have a system in place to guarantee safety. So what happened over time? We built roadway systems. We required the people drive on a particular side of the road. We put in speed bumps around schools. We put in traffic lights. We created a whole system of safety around driving. Now, within that system, you still have personal choice, whether or not you want to drive or not, i.e. use the technology or not. But now we have the system that helps guarantee safety for everyone using that technology. That's the place we feel we need to get to when we think about the big tech ecosystem. So if we move to the next slide, we can think about some particular ways to get there. The first is thinking about the notion of cultivating an ethic of responsibility in computer science. We can see this in other fields that are more mature in their development. For example, if you think about bioengineering, which has had its own series of scandals in the past, or if you think about the field of biology and some of the testing that's been done on humans, oftentimes without their consent. What happened over time is that a culture of ethics developed. We got institutional review boards that took a closer look at the kinds of science that were being done. At the same time, we had the societies themselves taking a broader view as to what people were actually doing in the development of biological technologies. One simple example is CRISPR. So Jennifer Doudna, who is one of the inventors of CRISPR technology, which is a gene editing technology, soon after inventing the technology, realized that it could potentially be used for various nefarious means. So what she got was a convening of people to come together to put a moratorium on the use of CRISPR technology on the human genome. And that's actually played out with respect to the few scientists who have violated that norm have been expelled from the respectable academic community and the research community as a result. We don't have that same kind of ethic in the computing community. The Association for Computing Machinery, which is the largest professional organization for computer scientists, does have a code of ethics, but there's very little actual recourse or very little sanction if someone were to violate that code of ethics. So we need to spend more time cultivating that ethic within the community. If we move to the next slide, we can think about the notion of checking the power of large technology companies. This will have to come through forms of regulation and other ways in which the free rein, in some sense, these companies have been given to basically take whatever action they want because of the regulatory oasis that's been created around them, as Jeremy alluded to earlier. That power needs to be checked. It needs to be reined in. And there's lots of ways we can think about doing this, things like sensible privacy policies. In some sense, the European Union is actually further out on this through the development of the General Data Protection Regulation. We don't have something similar to that at a national level in the United States, although in the state of California, we have something that looks very similar, and there's movement to try to make that a national policy or something similar to it, but we're not there yet. And this is one of the critical ways in which we can check the power of these large companies. But in other ways, as we think about automation moving forward, we think about the potential for job displacement. Well, it brings up the notion that if we see this coming down the road, in advance, what we should be planning for are greater educational opportunities and reskilling opportunities to be able to give people in sectors of the economy that will be more impacted by automation roads to be able to get to other sectors of the economy and new jobs that were less likely to be impacted by technology. Also thinking about things like content moderation guidelines, which many of the large tech companies have actually asked for, but in the United States, at least, Washington hasn't been very forthcoming with producing them yet. And we actually see in the rest of the world, similarly, a desire to have more content regulation on these platforms, but little done from a policy perspective to make that happen. But we do think the opportunity exists now. A policy window is opening up as regulators and lawmakers see more of an opportunity to be able to actually help shape this high-tech ecosystem, and more demand from individuals and from consumers to actually want to see these changes happen. If we move to the next slide, ultimately what this becomes is a matter of building a democracy that's capable of governing technology. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of polarization in the political sphere. We've seen log jams in various sorts of democratic institutions in terms of trying to pass policies. And we might think that our democracies are not up for this challenge. And really what we need to realize is the power that democracy has is a power that we give it. If democracy we don't think is up to the challenge, it's because we've let it get that way. We've rolled back certain institutions that existed that actually helped inform lawmakers about policymaking in the tech sphere. In the United States, for example, we used to have an Office of Technology Assessment that provided guidance to lawmakers on Capitol Hill with respect to the outcomes that particular technologies might produce. That office was in fact disbanded in the mid-1990s. And what that left us with was a democracy that's now informed by lobbyists from big tech companies. We need to get back to a place where we've empowered our democracy to make wise choices with respect to technology. And that becomes something that's the responsibility of individuals with respect to how we participate in our democracy and the things we demand from it in terms of thinking about the future of our ability to govern the big tech sphere. So with that said, I'll end our regular presentation and turn it over to some commentators.
Thanks a lot to all three of our authors for that really wonderful panoramic view of the territory covered by their book. It's my pleasure now to introduce our three commentators who come from different parts of academia. The first is Professor Vincent Konitzer, who is Head of Technical AI Engagement at the Institute for Ethics in AI here in Oxford, and Professor of Computer Science and Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Vince's research focuses on AI and game theory, and more recently on AI and ethics. Second commentator is Bryce Goodman, who is a DPhil student attached to the Institute for Ethics in AI. He is working on the ethics and governance of AI, disinformation, and various other topics. Among other positions, he serves as Chief Strategist for AI and Machine Learning at the US Department of Defense's Innovation Unit. And last but not least, Professor Ellen Landmore, who is a Professor of Political Science at Yale University, and I'm delighted to say for the next 6 months, a visiting fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI. She is a leading theorist of democracy, and her recent books include Open Democracy, published by Princeton in 2020, and last year, Debating Democracy, published by OUP, in which she argues against her co-author, Jason Brennan, that we need more democracy, not less. So I think we're going to pass over to Vince as the first commentator. So Vince, when you're ready. And I should just remind everyone again, we're very much looking forward to your questions through the chat function on YouTube. Vince, please go ahead.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction. And thank you so much, Jeremy, Rob, and Mehran, for having written this book and starting this conversation and being here with us. I think it's so important. And these are really important questions for us as the Institute for Ethics in AI as well, and to me personally. So having said that, maybe it's a little bit surprising that I'm going to start on a somewhat skeptical note and ask, how is this really different from past technologies? And I'm doing that in part because I think it will be a little bit more interesting if we appear to have some disagreement. But really, I'm doing it because I do think there are differences, but I want to put my finger on what exactly those are. So I want to compare it to some older technologies. This may be somewhat surprising given that I'm a computer scientist and an AI researcher, but we'll get back to that. And so let's not talk about rules of the road and driving. I thought for a while, maybe I'll talk just about email, right? And the fact that a lot of misinformation was already getting sent around on email well before Google and Facebook really entered the scene. But actually, I wanted to talk about something different. I do want to kind of disproportionately talk about disinformation and democracy. But so let me talk about television. I grew up in the Netherlands, and for most of my childhood, the Netherlands did not allow commercial broadcasters on TV. So most of my childhood, there were only public broadcasters. There were a few illegal ones, but I didn't really get exposed to those. And so this lasted, I think, until around 1990. And the idea behind that was that it was felt that, look, TV is going to have a significant impact in how people see the world. And whereas commercial broadcasters are just going to have a profit motive, and that's not going to be good for democracy. That was the view. Eventually, they relented. And so around 1990, I think, the first commercial broadcasters started to be allowed on TV. And for us as teenagers, this was exciting. And we were happy to see the commercial broadcasters, and they gave us shows like Baywatch, and we were happy about that. And then there started to be more innovation. And so at some point we had a channel dedicated to sports, right? And so we were happy about this. We had felt as teenagers that maybe the public channels were a little bit old-fashioned and boring and paternalistic. And so we liked this development. And we also felt that, we were a little bit more robust than everybody gave us credit for, and we wouldn't be so easily swayed by advertisements and all these things. And maybe in some ways it made us a little bit more aware of these kind of things in the world, and, prepared to be a little bit more skeptical. That's how we viewed it. Whether we were right, I don't know. And now the tables have turned, as I have kids, and my kids would like nothing more than to just sit there on YouTube and click on the next recommendation. And I would much rather have that they would watch something like those Dutch public television shows. They disagree and they feel like, it's all fine, and, Dad, you're worrying too much. And so maybe it's just, history repeating itself somewhat, right? What is really different here? And also I would say, if we're thinking about, modeling users, well, TV executives have long had a profit motive. They want to get eyeballs. They want to get ads seen. They want to know who their viewers are. Maybe they didn't have that level of detail on their viewers, but they certainly tried to understand who their viewers were and what they might be persuaded to buy, and so on. So what is really that difference? And by the way, I'll acknowledge here that, of course, TV itself nowadays, what we watch is much more driven by algorithms as well. But I want to, for the purpose of this comment, kind of put that aside and compare it to kind of a little bit more old-fashioned TV, if you will. So what is different? Now, there are many answers we could give. I want to propose a couple of them. As you might imagine, I'll agree with some of them more than others, but I just want to put them out there and see also what the authors think about these and where they line up. So one response would be, well, really nothing is all that different, right? That doesn't mean it's not worth thinking about. TV is very influential as well. I think the average American watches like 3 hours of TV a day. So both are important, and that's why it's worth thinking about. Answer two might be it's different, and this already came up in the presentation so far, that it's different in terms of Silicon Valley just not having been regulated to that extent. And maybe TV has been better regulated. And maybe it's a little bit easier in some ways to regulate TV. Maybe that's the difference. My third possible response is maybe the most skeptical and cynical of them all. Maybe what's going on is just that Silicon Valley is a very convenient scapegoat for other problems that we have. Maybe we have broader problems in society, right? Maybe what we really need is, for example, large investments in public education to make sure that people can become responsible consumers of information. But that would cost a lot of money and would be politically controversial. And so it's much easier for politicians to point the finger at Silicon Valley, where maybe it's easy to project them as being somewhat out of touch. And in some sense, maybe even though, as has been pointed out, yes, maybe most students at Stanford take a computer science course, and maybe the same is true at Oxford and Duke and Carnegie Mellon and all those places. But still, to most people, algorithms and AI are still kind of foreign, and it's always easier to blame whatever is kind of a little bit foreign and strange rather than really solving the issues directly, right? And in particular, the one way that you might motivate that this is actually what's going on is that we're actually not seeing all that much in terms of concrete regulation proposals, and relatively more just kind of blaming Silicon Valley. Not completely true, as Maren pointed out. Europe is doing a lot more already in terms of regulation, maybe California. Anyway, I wanted to put that one out there as well. My possible answer number 4 is that maybe the scale of this and the level of detail is what makes it qualitatively different, right? That with TV, nobody really had that detailed of a model of me or one individual as the companies do now, right? And a lot of this is not very transparent. We have data brokers. We don't really exactly have a good sense of where all that information is flowing. We realize that these models are out there, but that might be what our concern is, right? There might be privacy concerns, and there might be just having that detailed of a model. Maybe you're really able to manipulate people much more effectively than you otherwise would be. My 5th proposed answer to that question is maybe it's not so much about data and more about algorithms. That we worry that the algorithms will behave in unexpected and weird ways, and maybe they interact with us as human beings in unusual ways, right? There's this idea out there that if you go to YouTube and you kind of just continue clicking on the recommendations, you'll be led to ever more extreme content, right? And so there's this kind of unusual or unexpected interaction between the algorithm and what people's preferences and their behavior is like. And that might concern us. And maybe there's even strange interactions between different algorithms, right? Maybe somehow, getting directed from Facebook to YouTube and back, somehow those algorithms interact in a way that polarizes us all. We have those kind of concerns that, the algorithms will have some weird effects that we didn't anticipate, and that we might not even really be aware of, that nobody really could be a good whistleblower for that because nobody might even realize what's going on. That's one of the concerns. And then my 6th and final one would be, maybe we're not even so concerned about what's going on today, though clearly there are things to be concerned about today, but maybe a lot of the worry is driven by concerns about the future. That I think Jeremy said that, well, we expect this to continue, but maybe we even expect this to accelerate, right? And having algorithms taking over more and more of our lives, and really us losing control, right? I think an explicit way in which this concern is raised is also at Stanford. People are worried about foundation models, right? So these models that will be sitting there at the base of many different applications and have their own biases and other concerns baked in. And we won't, they'll just start to pervade society in a way that they never have before. So maybe at some level, we're really more concerned about this accelerating and the future being something entirely unlike what we've known, and maybe increasingly outside of our control. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. And I hope that the speakers have some ideas on which ones of these do they feel are kind of what really the difference is, or maybe it's something else entirely. And if so, what does that teach us about how we can address these issues? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vince. And I'm glad to see you weren't constrained by the philosopher's usual limitation to 3 points, and you gave us twice as many. That's really excellent. I'm now going to pass on to Bryce Goodman. Thanks, Bryce.
Great, thank you. So in a similar vein, I could spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about how much I agree with this book, especially living not quite in Silicon Valley, a little bit north of Silicon Valley, up in Marin. And certainly we've seen a change in sort of the public tenor when we discuss these tech companies, and I think this book provides a really valuable look into why that change is happening and should happen. But I thought it would be more interesting to take a more critical approach to the book. So what I want to do is offer my 3 critiques of big tech. So the first sort of line of critique begins with the question, is big tech really that big of a problem? My hypothesis here is that we are concerned about big tech in part because it's something that we, meaning most everyone who's here, interact with on a daily basis, right? We go on to Google to search for things, we log on to Facebook to connect with our friends. And so the downsides of these technologies, the problems, are really obvious to us, right? We hear our, talking about some misinformation that she's read on Facebook, or we see in our own Google searches the kinds of biases that we get in results. But of course, the fact that this is obvious to us doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most important issue. We don't see, or at least many of us, unless we live near a coal mine, don't see a mountain that's been stripped bare to be mined. Unless we're in prisons, we don't suffer from the sort of abuses that happen there. And so I think there's this kind of bias towards the fact that we're a technological society, we interact with these things all the time, and so therefore it becomes obvious. And the argument I'm making isn't, oh, those things are worse, therefore we should only talk about them, but rather that I think we have a limited amount of attention, and I think a disproportionate amount of that attention, that kind of outrage quotient, is consumed by concerns over technology, at least certainly in this part of the world. And then another point, within this is big tech that big of a problem, just to take head on, is the kind of disinformation, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook scandal. In the work that I've done, which has been looking at disinformation, with U.S. government agencies, as well as connecting with folks like Alex Stamos, who's now at Stanford leading the Internet Observatory, there is little to no evidence that any of the coordinated disinformation activities led by Cambridge Analytica had any impact at all on the election outcome. And in fact, what they were doing was no different than what algorithmic advertising is in general, which we might object to, and that's fine. But I think it's important to take that apart a bit and recognize that it's a scandal that I think has been used in a politically efficacious way to try to dismiss the fact that we have seen this massive rise in populism. I'll come back to that question later. So the second line of critique is it bad that big tech is big? So I understand there's a sort of aesthetic revulsion to the fact that the bookstores down the street are going out of business while Jeff Bezos is flying around his rocket ship, and that's gross on some level and feels unjust on another. But from a pragmatic standpoint, if we want to regulate big tech, which I think we all agree that we need to, it's going to be much easier to do if those companies remain large. And I think the reason for that is that, one, they have a reputational risk, which smaller companies don't. So all of the dirtiest things that happen in data and harvesting data and selling data aren't being perpetrated by Google or Facebook, but by these much smaller data brokers who don't have the reputational risk that those companies do, and also don't have the resources to put into complying with regulation, right? This is something that was a big fear around the GDPR, the EU data legislation, that we would create these barriers to compliance that smaller companies wouldn't be able to meet. And then, finally, there's this kind of monopoly argument, right? Amazon has a monopoly on a large share of e-commerce, but in the past, monopolies were dismantled because it was shown that they harmed consumers, and we haven't been able to show that. So we would need to fundamentally rethink, what the purpose of dismantling monopolies are. And then lastly, I think that my sort of third line of critique is that I think the roots of this problem run far deeper than we let on if we just focus on big tech. So, for example, this question of optimization is not in any way unique to engineering, computer science. It goes back to economics and econometrics and welfare economics in the 20th century. Before that, towards the philosophy of positivism, and then before that to this Enlightenment notion that we can use the tools of science to discover universal human values and in some sense solve moral dilemmas. And that belief is something that is deeply embedded in our culture at numerous levels. It's embedded in a lot of liberal political philosophy. And I'm not sure that just by kind of cornering out computer science, we're going to be able to really get at that deeper issue, which I think is taking a the wrong tools and trying to apply them outside of their domain. And the last thing I want to say is that I think all of these critiques of technology risk becoming technocratic in the sense that we want to blame social ills like the rise of populism, like the decline of the humanities on technology. And by doing so, we actually are giving even more power over to that technology. I mean, the messy truth is that President Trump got elected because a large number of people supported him, and that populism is on the rise because a large number of people around the world hold those beliefs. And the idea that by tweaking a Facebook algorithm, we're going to somehow combat that, I think is an attractive one, insofar as it allows intellectuals to not hold themselves accountable and instead blame these tech companies, but I think is ultimately both dishonest and actually continues on the very kind of ideology that we're trying to critique. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryce. And now I'm going to pass over to our third commentator, Hélène Landemore.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for including me. I'm delighted to be joining this panel. So full disclosure, I am one of the co-editors of the book mentioned by Professor Cheng earlier, that was co-edited by Rob Reich, so DT Square, or Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, which came out in early 2021 with Chicago University Press. So I have an ongoing work relationship and friendly relationship with Rob. So I like System Error a lot. It's a page turner, very educational. It's extremely dense and rich, as well as pedagogical and entertaining. So it's what you would expect from a book oriented toward a general audience. And the book in particular is very successful at the diagnostic part of its promise. It gets the picture of what went wrong with big tech right in a descriptive sense. It's about the optimization mindset and the profit motive combined, the libertarian anti-government ethos, together with the lack of effective regulation by a hapless or perhaps co-opted Congress that blinks every time you say, but China. But at the end of the day, though, and I'll offer critical remarks as well, it's a book that leaves me hungry for more when it comes to solutions, for two reasons. One, the authors chose to devote most of the book to the diagnostic part and not so much, and little of the book to the solutions. I wish, in a way, that the ratio had been reversed. But perhaps I just have to wait for the sequel, even though your title did promise you'd explain how to reboot. And second, I think it's for another reason. The reason why the solutions feel a bit incomplete is because much of the status quo views about democracy and the economy are left unchallenged, or when they are challenged, as in the one paragraph evocation of workplace democracy at the end, too little is said about what such a massive change, would require, how it could ever take place, or how it's compatible with some of the other solutions put forward. For example, I was thinking that you recommend more workplace democracy, but in the next paragraph you want more competition, which would not necessarily play in favor of more democratic workplaces. So how do we resolve those tensions? So even though the book is meant as a provocation to Silicon Valley, it seems to me that the authors, in fact, pretty much accept the flawed versions of liberal democracy and globalized hypercapitalism that we currently live in as an unchangeable given, when in fact, what the radical diagnostic they convincingly come up with suggests that we need revolutionary ideas at this point, ideas that really shake us out of our complacency. And the one exception, I would say, to my mind, in the list of solutions is workplace democracy, but it's not developed. So aside from that one, take democracy as a set of political institutions. We're told in the book that it's the solution to many of our problems with big tech. We need more regulations, but the book takes a very sort of I'm tempted to say, naive view of what democracy is, at least in the reality we experience. It describes it as a system that gives us the promise of freedom, equality, deliberation, and all kinds of various goods. But it's kind of like papering over the reality of our dysfunctional democracies, which do not deliver on that promise at all. In the US and many other countries, democracies have actually overseen and done nothing to stop the massive rise in economic inequalities that we've observed since the 1980s. They've provided virtually no space for actual quality deliberation among citizens. And in fact, they limit by design the access of power to ordinary citizens. If you're not a millionaire and or a lawyer, you can forget about being elected to the American Congress. So democracy technically has let global tech do what they want for far too long. And you say so in the book, in some parts of the book. So it's very unclear to me why you think that democracy, more democracy of the kind we're familiar with, is going to be the solution. And if it is the solution, it will have to be a different kind of democracy, not the kind we're familiar with. And so I guess my question to the authors is, how do you create the kind of democracy that would actually be capable of regulating big tech effectively? So Rob is a friend, as I said, and knows my work quite well. So I think he won't be surprised to hear that the solutions I have in mind, are in a vein of completely radically transforming our electoral democracies and displacing power from elected bodies to randomly selected bodies. So I saw no traces of such ideas in the book. And I was curious what he thinks and why they chose not to include such ideas, for example. But I'm even curious about, I'm so sorry, I'm in an office where the light goes off. So.
The optimized electrical system there is failing us.
So anyway, so I was, there are some ideas that I see traces of in the book, but I think even those that do get mentioned would have deserved more emphasis and attention. So I'll mention 3 ideas in particular, 2 that get some mention and 1 that doesn't. So one is the idea of an assembly of citizen legislators, right? The idea is to bring together random samples of citizens to bear on legislation and policy making, so that the regulations on big tech would be informed by citizens themselves, to bypass the sort of electoral stalemates that we observe on a daily basis. So I'm not talking about taking on board my own open democracy model, something much more modest that consists in hybridizing, electoral democracy with participatory and deliberative processes. And in fact, there's also someone that I was surprised not to see mentioned in the book, which is who is your Stanford colleagues, Jim Fishkin. He's one of the rare figures who have tried to fight the polarization in American politics with a deliberative poll called America in One Room, where he brought over, I think, 400 people from all over the US, chosen on the basis of stratified random sampling. And he had them debate about various issues in the country. And I think they could easily have talked about big tech and these kind of issues. Another thing that could have been mentioned is that they've used AI successfully in a deliberative poll run in Chile in 2020. So there's all kinds of ways in which these solutions actually are very empowering of citizens. So that's one aspect of the book that I thought could have been enriched by the deliberative democracy literature. This is no longer just fanciful. The OECD has produced a report 2 years ago called the Deliberative Wave, where they document more than 600 cases of such deliberative mini publics, so deliberative bodies convened at random on the basis of random sampling, and they do provide venues for deliberation, which is something that you currently do not have in parliaments anymore, where people just posture and grandstand and try to score points. At the global level also, I wanted to mention that there's been the first global assembly based on random selection took place in October 2021 in the margins of COP26. It took place on the issue of climate change, but you could easily imagine doing the same thing for big tech, questions and technological issues. Another idea that does make an appearance, that does not make an appearance in the book, is the idea of empowering users or producers by finding a way to make corporations like Facebook or Google or Amazon pay the public for the data they extract from us, right? So you have people like Glenn Well and Jaron Lanier that have called for this kind of solution. That seems to me another more radical sort of solution that I didn't see discussed in the book, and I was really wondering why. I thought you would engage with it perhaps when you talked about the universal basic income. it seems to me that rewarding people or paying people for their data is in a way more respectful of their dignity, because it does take their dignity as creators of data seriously, rather than sort of like, well, pay them to keep social peace in a world where there's not enough labor for everyone, enough work for everyone. So there's a third idea that this time does not make an appearance. I'm sorry, that this time does make an appearance, but a very brief one on page 256. There's one paragraph exactly devoted to the idea of democratizing the workplace. So the idea here is to democratize big tech by empowering workers and giving them rights of representation on boards of directors. So as Rob knows, this is an idea I'm very fond of. With a group of female scholars, we founded a movement called Democratize Work. And we have a book by that title coming out with Chicago University Press this coming spring. It's an idea that I imagine is anathema to Silicon Valley, because when Silicon Valley talks about democratizing tech, what they mean is decentralizing power, never actually empowering citizens or workers, qua-citizens or workers. Yes, yet it seems like a very powerful option. The book actually does a good job of showing how democratic governments are incapable of reining in big tech companies, or of doing so in time, in the relevant amount of time. It takes too long, it's not efficient. The people in charge understand too little, too late. So indeed, democratizing the production and commercial and the companies that produce and commercialize algorithm would seem to be like a plausible alternative. The same way that Thomas Piketty and others have made the case that governmental redistribution is too little, too late, or too leaky, we need to work on redistributive solutions to technological inequalities. So I was wondering why there's not more in the book, because the way the book presents the idea is on this exact same level as much less radical ideas, such as providing ethical courses to engineers, or reviving an expertocratic body like the Office of Technological Assessment, perhaps even using it as a vehicle for citizens' participation. So these are all commonsensical ideas, very compelling ones, but they're not nearly as paradigm shifting as democratizing corporations like Facebook or Google or Amazon. I mean, we're talking about a radically different society and a radically different economy. And there's not much in the book that prepared us for that kind of proposal. And there's not much in the book by way of a justification for it. So again, I think it's a brilliant idea, but I would like to know what you think is, the plausibility of this proposal in the world we live in now, where we've let a caste of technological emperors accrue so much power. It's hard to imagine Zuckerberg or Bezos accepting that 40% of the workforce would have a seat on the board of administrators of Facebook or Amazon. In fact, in Germany, where they do have such a system, it's called Mitbestimmung or co-determination, it took a world war to basically be able to entrench that in the German constitution. And even though the economic model works and is compatible with this structure, I just don't know any other country that has managed to operate the transition from strict capitalism, where only shareholders have a say in the governance of firms, to a system that might be termed stakeholderism, right? That Germany is an example of, but kind of like the lone one. And another question I have, and I promise I'm done, is democratizing work compatible with reintroducing more competition? And if it's not compatible, which goal should we privilege? Because imagine that we want to address the problem of the extraordinary power of Facebook. Do we want to break it down? Do we really need 10 Facebooks? My own view is that we just need one, but one that's thoroughly democratized and functions more like a global public utility. A Facebook in a way where workers and producers have some amount of control on the production and use of algorithm, as well as the distribution of profits, which could be usefully redirected to data generating producers rather than shareholders alone. So basically the book opens a can of worms and stops where it gets really interesting for me. So I can't wait for you to start working on the sequel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hélène. So I'm going to give the authors a chance to think about these questions by asking my own softball question. in the meantime, right? Which in a way I think will pull together some of these points. So the background is that the societal impact of digital technology is not a matter of necessity or fate, it's a matter of choice. But in fact, these choices are being made by a certain small group, and this small group, basically big tech engineers, capitalists, and they make these decisions, which then are often presented as inevitabilities. I take it the diagnosis is there are two things wrong with the way they're making these decisions. One is the fact that it's a small group making them, therefore it disempowers the rest of us. And the second is the fact that they're making them on the basis of a mistaken ideology, which is the ideology of the optimizing mindset. And that's the diagnosis. The prescription is democracy is a cure for these two phenomena by taking away decisions from the small group and democratizing them. So I can see that as an answer, although subject to Helene's caveat that maybe democracy right now isn't really a vehicle for collective agency. I mean, I think Helene at one point, not in this exchange, mentioned some research that said that even quite large majorities can't really get their way in contemporary democratic systems if there is an entrenched opposition to them amongst the socioeconomic elite, right? So, but let's just accept that point that if you worked on the idea of democracy and were more creative about how democracy ought to work, you would address the agency point. But then there's the other point. Why is it assumed in the book that democracies would not also adopt the optimizing mindset? And I think Bryce was making this point that actually it understates the problem to say it's common amongst engineers and capitalists. It's actually very common amongst economists. It's common amongst politicians who are obsessed with maximizing GDP. I mean, if you look at Britain's policy on AI, there is some reference to ethics, but the ultimate driving goal seems to be to maximize GDP. So that's where I kind of felt there was a disconnect. Like I assume you're not Habermasians who believe that the ethical truth is determined by a democratic process. I assume you believe that democracies can get things wrong. So what's the grounds for thinking that democracy will address the problem of optimizing mindsets? For example, you raised the question, what are the decisions that should not be automated? What's the reason for thinking that democracies will come up with a better answer to that question?
So John, can I follow up on that, and in the theory of affording you more time to think about answers to the—
That was entirely my motivation.
Yeah, so I wanted to build on what John is saying because I had the same reaction, and there's a way of putting it in a maybe more hardball-y way, which is that there's a kind of fundamental tension in the book because, you know, you say one aspect of the system error is that there's this assumption that we can measure the values that are relevant in the trade-offs that have to go into the design of AI. And it's a bad thing for AI engineers to be the ones making those trade-offs and then imposing those trade-offs on us. And then what's the reboot? The reboot is let's let democracy make those trade-offs. So, but I mean, this is really a question not only for the three of you, but also for maybe Helene, and it picks up on what Bryce was saying. You know, how does an appeal to democracy help if the values at stake in trading off, say, privacy and agency values against efficiency and maybe public health values, if those values are not susceptible to measurement, then, you know, having a democratic resolution of the trade-off and then putting that into an AI, right? The AI has to assume that the values are computationally tractable. Why isn't the system error the assumption that the values at stake in these very important decisions are computationally tractable? That's at least one system error. And the reboot is not an appeal to democracy, but the decision to take these decisions out of the sphere of technology that has to assume a structure of value that distorts those values.
All right, so we have now peppered you, bombarded you perhaps with a bunch of softballs and hardballs, etc. So whichever one of these balls you want to choose to run with, please go ahead.
All right, I'm going to kick us off. I just want to say it is such a privilege to have the assembly of folks who have offered comments here, mapping certain ways onto the disciplinary mix of our collaboration. So I want to express my gratitude for the challenges. Nothing more wonderful than an opportunity for this kind of exchange. So you've all noted in some way how the ultimate terrain on which we wish to referee these larger questions about big tech is the terrain of democracy itself. And Hélène is pushing us for a more aspirational, radical overhaul of democracy. And John and Ruth's questions are asking as well about the kind of normative background assumptions we're making about what makes democracy something worthwhile as the relevant alternative to the optimizing mindset of the technologists and the private governance that we currently have in virtue of big tech. I'll begin just by saying something about how we help ourselves in various brief moments in the book to describe democratic governance and institutions as a kind of technology itself, an institutional design whose purpose, in a rather minimal way, is to create a legitimate mechanism for refereeing persistent value conflicts among citizens treated as equals, and then affording them an opportunity for the aspirational project of collective self-determination. And that's a high-minded way of saying something that you would be able to express much more simply, which is that democratic institutions of many different kinds are ways of trying to provide a fair process for the persistent disagreements, preferences, and values among citizens. And in that respect, we think we can defend what we describe in the book as a guardrails approach to thinking about democracy. It's not an institutional design that's meant in the first instance to optimize anything. Its core virtue is legitimacy and presuming the equal voice and agency of citizens doing things together. So we should expect it to be suboptimal in its outputs in many respects, and that is in certain respects its great virtue. Allow the private marketplace to pursue its various innovations and bringing aspirational products to the market. There's a familiar dynamic in which power consolidates once a product line matures, and then democracy kicks into motion, so to speak, to install some sensible guardrails. That's the modest aspiration of democracy we present. And I'll just conclude my comment by thinking about Vince's really interesting invitation to think historically about other technologies and whether there's anything different today. There's a certain aspect of the book that tries to describe a race between disruption and democracy. And that's where the historical matter is brought to bear. Following the lines I just described, we talk about the telegraph and we don't mention television, but you could bundle that into it as well. The thing that I want to call attention to, Vince, and I think you are likely to agree with this, is the idea that we should mark what's going on today as a relevant input for our consideration democratically, that the value of freedom of expression is something that arose in a particular historical context in which information was difficult to produce, distribute, and circulate. And if you expected that a well-functioning democracy depended upon a well-informed citizenry, insisting upon the value of freedom of expression has all kinds of benefits for the individual, but collectively, in a classic John Stuart Mill style argument here, you didn't want anyone to have the capacity to block or censor speech, because that would further make difficult this distribution of information. But the modern technologies of information communication today, television certainly one of them, but even more so now with the internet, give us a world of superabundant information. We are swimming in an ocean of content where we need a search engine to identify what's relevant. We need an algorithmic ranking system to tell us what it is we want to see, all of course personalized to us particularly. no gatekeepers anymore. Everyone, someone with a megaphone, an algorithmic amplification opportunity, and the proprietary opaque algorithms, whether it's search or ranking, at work in the companies. That presents huge challenges to the informational health of a democratic society that are quite different from the bandwidths of television, and then the public insistence, as you described in the Netherlands, of requiring a kind of public interest that's installed within the permissible television operators. And then journalistic standards, back to an ethic of responsibility that arose within many different forms of media to be responsible gatekeepers. That's what we've wiped away with the internet. And you could describe this as a great benefit for democratic voice. Everyone can now bark at the universe and go viral. But we want to point to the value tensions and trade-offs. And that's, again, where we think minimally a guardrails approach is necessary. And for sure, from a legitimacy standpoint, this ought not be Mark Zuckerberg's decision to make. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy and then to Meron.
So thanks, everyone, the official discussants, and John and Ruth for adding in your questions on top. There's nothing better than to have this kind of serious engagement with the book. I want to say a couple of things in response. I mean, there's so much to dig into here, but I'll offer, kind of one preliminary response. And it begins with kind of recognizing a tension in two streams of the comments. So on the one hand, Bryce and even Vince say, this is kind of a normal reality associated with new technology. There's like bumps along the way. They're going to be a set of harms. We could debate, how serious those harms are. And Bryce, we tried to be, I think, very responsible in our description of the effects of social media on polarization, to recognize that that's primarily driven by television. It's amplified maybe by technology, but, so Bryce and Vince are like, this is a kind of normal world that we're in. And then Helene comes in, and a little bit of Bryce's comments and say, and we need to wipe away capitalism and democracy at the same time, right? And I think there's a tension between those two perspectives on what the enterprise is in the book. And I come into this conversation both as a social scientist and a former policymaker, which Ruth didn't mention at the outset. So I've served in government, in the Obama administration, both terms. I've got a pretty pragmatic bone in my body, which has affected both how I've taught about these issues, but also how the three of us have engaged Rob's normative, ideal type, first best perspective, Meron's building the code from the scratch, and then me thinking about the political realities of policymaking. And I guess what I'd say, recognizing that tension in the comments and my own lens that I bring to this, is that I look at citizens' passivity towards tech as being driven by two things in particular. The first is that there's a sort of a sense that technology and what it is and how it's built is just fundamentally inaccessible to us normal people. There's superpowers and super skills and knowledge that's in the hands of the people down the road from me, and a kind of deference to their knowledge, and I'm never going to understand what they know. And the second thing is that the kinds of problems that are being created just seem insoluble, right? And so this kind of framing that Meron described that technology companies give most consumers, which is like, yeah, if you love the iPhone, you can have it, but you have to trade off a bunch of other things, or you can use our Google search, but it comes with personalized and targeted advertising. People just accept that binary choice. And I think, our argument of the book is that you don't need to be a technologist to understand the values that are at stake. And these problems are not insoluble. And so to come along with a perspective that says you can't make any progress on these issues unless you do away with capitalism and fundamentally reinvent it, or you recognize that democracy is a broken institutional model and it needs to be upended in ways that are not politically pragmatic, doesn't work for me, right? As a perspective on our enterprise in the book. And instead, I think what we're trying to communicate, especially to citizens writ large as we get beyond our kind of teaching community at Stanford, is that, You don't need to understand these technologies inside and out to see what values are at stake. And when you recognize that these values are at stake, you can introduce these value trade-offs into our normal politics, recognizing that normal politics is broken in lots of the ways that Helene described, and that lobbyists are too powerful and too few people actually exercise the right to vote, and disproportionately it's lawyers that choose to stand for office and not enough technologists and people of other backgrounds. But actually, we're generally telling people when we're talking about this book good news about what we think democracy is already proving itself capable of. And we point first and foremost to the work that's happening in Europe, which is basically not visible to most people in the United States unless they're in the technology sector, which is that people don't realize that there is an alternative to the status quo. There is a different refereeing of these value trade-offs, and Europe offers a vision of what that looks like. California then offers a vision of what that's looks like with its own leadership on sort of algorithmic transparency and privacy. And even the skepticism that we have of our own democratic institutions in Washington, where you think about the embarrassing caricatures of our senators, has really been upended by a moment in which really credible, thoughtful, and nuanced legislation that has bipartisan sponsorship is being generated by our democratic institutions, whether it relates to issues like data privacy or data portability, or dealing with some of the complexity and nuance around competitive markets in big tech. And so I'd say it may make folks uncomfortable, but we end up in the negotiation of the three of us as a set of much more pragmatic institutionalists who recognize that the market is generating extraordinary benefits through R&D and science and tech and the creation of these technologies. A bit like Bryce, we see harms, but it's not like there's fire everywhere and we need to fix everything about the world through the enterprise of this book, but instead to say that these value trade-offs that are now being refereed inside private companies are not addressing social harms that lots of us care about. And we need to energize our normal politics to address them. And while we are very open to going the step that Bryce described, which is to say, hey, these things you're pointing out about big tech are not just about big tech. There's some deep problems with capitalism, as Helene suggested, around workplace democracy. We're like, yeah, there's something to that. We can still make progress on privacy without rewriting all the rules of capitalism. But yes, that's important. And just like I also believe, as Helene knows from some of my own work, that there are ways of experimenting with new democratic institutions that might address the ways in which existing institutions fall short. I'm also not of the view that we can't make progress with the institutions that we have. So that's a tension that I see in the comments, and it frames for me why I think we ended up where we are. And that may be frustrating to others who say, yeah, the problems that you're pointing to are just one of many problems, like our failure to address climate, our failure to address growth inequality. So let's rewrite the rules of capitalism and let's rewrite the structure of democracy. And I am so happy to be a part of those conversations, but I also want to address these harms in the near term. And I think we can do that through normal democratic politics. And I think the view that we are challenging among the technologists is an anti-regulation view, which is fundamentally just an anti-democratic view. It's an argument that we are the best minds of the world and we know what's good for you and we should own these choices on behalf of society. And I think that model is already broken, and we may not have the first best model to respond to that, but I think we have a lot of the starting points.
So maybe as the third, I'll add comments. And one of the beauties of being the third is the first two already give most of the great ideas. But one of the things I'd like to first start off with is just a thank you to all the commentators for excellent ideas and engagement. I mean, it's really nice to be able to dig into media issues. And I really appreciated maybe to think about, the history, Vince starting with a historical perspective, which is just a wonderful reflection. I would start by saying, yes, this time I think it's actually different. And the reason why it's different is because at one level, the technology makes it different. Personalization allows for ability to micro-target at a level that we've never seen before, that we never were able to do with television or radio or any kind of mass media. And another thing that makes it different is that the internet is two-way engagement. So rather than simply the broadcast model where we were sending information out, we have a back channel now where people click on things. And that click is a very powerful indicator of what are the things people are interested in, and more importantly, what are the ways that they can potentially be manipulated if we wanted to manipulate them. And so I think that conglomeration, when you combine that with the ability to optimize for that potential manipulation, does create a model that's different this time. In terms of the points that were brought up, I think, Bryce brought up a very important point, which is big tech being big really a problem? And I think you're going to hear this theme from me over and over. Yes, because it is different this time. And just to give you an example in terms of the concentration of power, if we were to go back, say, 25 years ago, the top 5 companies, we talk about this in the book, by market capitalization were General Electric, Royal Dutch Shell, Coca-Cola, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, and ExxonMobil. So broad range of companies from across the economy, different kinds of businesses. If we look at what those same 5 companies are in 2020, it's Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, and Facebook. Right, the concentration of wealth is just dramatically different now. They're the only trillion-dollar companies that exist, other than if you think of Saudi Aramco, are all big tech companies. Right, there is just a level of concentration of power, and that market power has now been turned into political power that creates a different dynamic. And in terms of what that means for our democracy, I agree with you, Ellen. I think, at some point we probably need a sequel. I think we actually need like a 7-part series like Harry Potter, because we're not going to address these, problems. I think you're absolutely right. They're very big. But it gets us into the issue of when you think about this, getting into the actual solutions themselves, what are the ways that we dissect it? One of the issues that's thrown around much of the time is antitrust. Shouldn't we just break these companies up into a bunch of smaller companies? And I don't think that's the answer. And I think we talk about that in the book a bit. Breaking Facebook up into 5 Facebooks without any other kind of guardrails put into the system will not solve the problem because of the natural monopolistic tendencies that exist online. And what we'll get if we create 5 Facebooks in 10 years, we will have one large Facebook again and 4 other failed companies. What we really need are to put in the kind of guardrails that allow for real competition in that space. We need things like interoperability of data that allows for smaller players to actually be able to interact without being disadvantaged by network effects against the larger players. When we think about what's the actual harm to consumers, so in that antitrust space, right, there's the notion of antitrust is predicated on the notion of oftentimes financial harms to consumers. Where is that financial harm? I think actually the point, Ellen, you bring up about what is the value of data indicates the financial harm, because actually what we're forcing consumers to do when we have these large monopolies in very limited space is we're forcing them into onerous terms of service that they are giving up their data, which is not actually have some economic value being placed on it. And as a result, we don't measure an economic harm in the traditional sense of antitrust. If we were to actually think about what is the value of that data being in some sense a capitulation, what forced capitulation of customers to give it up if they want access to these particular services because they're only provided by a small number of companies, then we can actually unpack a financial harm. But to actually run counter to that point, which is I think an interesting thing, is it's important to think about how you value that data. I think some proposals that are put forward to try to value the data at a personal level, to say an individual should have value associated with their data. And I would disagree with that. I think the value of any individual's data is actually minimal. It basically goes to zero. The only value of that data is in its aggregate form when we think about how it can actually be used to, within optimization, be able to do this kind of targeting and get the kind of concentration of power as a result of having all that data into a machine, going into some machine to find patterns rather than any individual's data. So in the end, to wrap up a little bit, I think the notion of thinking about a more radical change to democracy, I think, is a beautiful one. I actually agree with that point, but I don't think it's an either or. I don't think by arguing that for having a democracy try to solve these problems, we necessarily are saying it has to be democracy in its current form. I think the notions of thinking about bringing in more participatory governance in big tech, for example, or different models of democracy, sort of the deliberation in a room, are actually wonderful ways to be able to think more about the value trade-offs. And ultimately that gets to Ruth's final point, which is that, we can't actually measure these value trade-offs. So how do we hope to optimize for things that we can't actually measure? And I think that's actually a lovely point in itself, but at the same time, it doesn't prevent us from creating guardrails around having an optimization over indexed on some particular value. So even if we can't measure them precisely, still being able to have some guardrails in place where we say we don't want to go too far in any one direction still gets us some value.
Thank you so much. Before going to questions from the audience, there's quite a few of them. I just want to give Hélène an opportunity very briefly to respond to Jeremy's point about the need to be pragmatic and therefore not really resting at all on overhauls of capitalism and democracy. I think you're muted though, Hélène.
Yes, so I actually consider myself a pragmatist as well on some level. So maybe we have different definitions, but if you think in terms of policy pragmatism, that sounds to me like, it's what we heard during the 80s to the late 2000s, before the big economic collapse, before the pandemic, before Trump. It's stated like there was only so many space for political imagination. And I really think we're past that. I think it's time to be not pragmatic and to be bold and radical. And in fact, you are, because in the book, you do put that, that proposal for workplace democracy. So I'm just curious why, you're not limiting yourself. So why now backtrack and say you're a pragmatist and we just have to work with what we've got? And especially since, John mentioned that article by Gilens and Page that I'm also fond of using, that basically documents, and it's controversial, but it documents that only 10% of the American population is really causal policy-wise and in terms of lawmaking, that Congress responds to the preferences of the 10 richest percent of the American population, and the rest get democracy by coincidence when they happen to want the same thing. So what makes us so sure that that very system is capable of fundamentally changing? And I agree, you might say, well, the Biden administration actually has done 180 degrees on some things. And so, but it doesn't get much done because the system is great. And so I just think pragmatism for me, it's at least as you seem to approach it, it's something in which I don't really believe anymore. I think the times are bad, and we need radical change. And when you mentioned the example of Europe with the GDPR, Europe is actually pointing to technocratic solution because it's really not an example of a democracy, actually. So if that's the solution, turns out that's a good policy, but I'm not sure it's reassuring in terms of democratic participation and deliberation. And I'm sorry, I'm in the dark again, so I don't know what that means. But
I think you need to wave your arms a lot more when making your points to keep the lights on, Hélène. I think that's the problem. But there was a kind of tension there, though, between Jeremy and Mehran. I think Mehran was a bit more sympathetic to your more radical approach. Let me now go to the questions, and I'd like to, because there's quite a few of them, I think some of them are quite lengthy, if we could have fairly succinct responses. So the first one is from Patrick Stevens. He says, it's very easy as individuals to despair at the direction of travel, but feel very powerless in the face of it. It feels like these are decisions only taken by regulators and others. What can we do? The word monopoly doesn't really reflect how large some big tech companies are. A monopoly is a company which dominates the market for one good. Most of these companies dominate several. Is our vague conception of choice upon which democracy is founded still meaningful in a world where companies have learned to game our psychology so effectively? So basically, has big tech already undermined our capacity for democratic deliberation? Who wants to take that one?
You should just assign one of us the question and we'll punt it to someone else.
How about you then, Rob?
Okay. Well, as Mehran said, the kind of monopolistic tendencies of the big tech powers of our age aren't just a function of a kind of radical and genius insight of a founder or a technology solution itself, but the ways in which these technologies permeate every aspect of the economy and present these network effects, giving all of the companies not only the network effect which binds people to one platform or one company, But since we're talking about digital data, digital platforms, the dominant players get early insight into the emergence of competitors. And then you get this mergers and acquisitions thirst, which you see the dominant players gobble up any potential early entrant that's meaningfully competitive. So I am, if I've tracked the question right, I do think there's something appreciably different about the current era or moment of consolidation and monopolization, but not one that even the kind of familiar tools of antitrust, suitably rejuvenated for the current age, but not radical new inventions, are necessary to try to tackle.
Next question from KK. The danger posed by technology has been mostly emphasized in the private context, i.e. unwieldy corporations engaging in surveillance capitalism, data harvesting, etc. But what about governments? A recent example, the abuse of the Israeli-developed Pegasus software by the Polish government to spy on the opposition. What should we do if governments abuse these instruments? So Jeremy, you've been in government, as you pointed out. Do you want to take that one?
I want to answer this question in part by speaking to the evolution of the moment that we're in. We did an event on campus with our students where we brought in the leadership of the National Security Agency of the United States and the leadership of Facebook to talk on a panel about the protection of people's privacy. And I think what was so stunning in 2016 in comparison to 2010 or 2012 was that groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation felt a great degree of comfort about the kind of guardrails that exist around the exercise of public power with respect to surveillance, but tremendous dissatisfaction and discomfort about the total absence of guardrails and perspective around the exercise of power by private companies. And maybe it's all just a matter of degree, but when we're talking to students and even in the book about the way in which people have approached surveillance or access to data, at least in the United States, we have a whole architecture that is designed to referee the balance between the benefits of access to data and the potential harms to individual privacy in health, in education, a number of domains. None of those things exist with respect to the exercise of private power. Now, it's absolutely the case as we enter a new moment, which is about more than data. It's about algorithmic decision-making in public agencies, replacing human judgment and the like. We are beginning to get a moment of kind of regulatory innovation and approach that's designed to pay close attention to public agencies and how public agencies are taking advantage of these technologies in ways that may be harmful to the interests and values of citizens. But I don't want people to walk away and think that somehow sort of that gets at the root of our underlying challenges, because the most unaccountable power that we're concerned about in this book is the exercise of private power using these new technologies. And maybe that's a perspective that's related to our own sort of lives and experiences in the United States and in advanced economies and the like, where there are a set of guardrails around public institutions, which, however, fragile they are in the current moment, as Helene has pointed to, have proved somewhat viable to some of the things that might be more possible by public agencies in other contexts. But at least where we start is just the huge disconnect between the oversight and guardrails that already exist around public agencies and the total absence of anything around private companies.
Thank you. So another question now from Professor Georgie Bourne. She's a professor of music here in Oxford and is interested in the relationship of AI and music. She says, although our North American colleagues often don't recognize the model, it is our European public service media organizations that have historically been charged with having market-correcting effects and value-driven interventions compared to the global media companies. Can public service media be charged with doing the same in the AI-driven big tech sector? Mehran, do you want to take that one?
I can try to take that one. I'm not sure that the relationship is as clear in terms of the role that the media would have in with respect to AI. I think the issue that comes up is, to what extent are you trying to engage your audience and in what way? So I think in that sense, if you think about the public interest, you could actually think about personalization in the public interest, right? You could identify places where individuals, for example, need more information because they've only been given a particular diet of information. Rather than continuing to give them the thing they're most likely to click on, you could actually try to broaden their information diet as a matter of decision making with respect to what you're trying to optimize for the AI. So I think there is potential there. Part of it gets back to the issue of what we want to actually harness this technology for. Currently, with the profit motive, mostly what it's harnessed for is doing things like getting people to click on ads, and that involves a bunch of other things like getting people to remain on platforms as long as possible, engage with pieces of content, whatever the case may be. But if we were to think about a different model where the point of that engagement is not clicking on advertising, for example, or behavior manipulation, if the point of that is greater education of individuals, a broader sense of civic responsibility and greater information for decision making, we can actually build algorithms to try to get people that information. And that's probably more likely to come from the public sphere than the private sphere.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two questions which I'm wishfully putting together because I think they are in some sense pro-regulation. So one is from Ian G. Is it not the business model which needs rebooting rather than the technology? Infuse the business model with better standards and the tech will follow. Indeed, regulation has largely failed in most sectors because it focuses on competition rather than consumer benefit. So perhaps regulation needs to focus on purpose, consumer protection, and avoiding, avoiding some kind of dominance rather than market dominance. Maybe it's democratic dominance. If you are the product, then maybe it shouldn't be allowed. And on the same vein, I think this was maybe addressing some things that Vince said. This is from Kyle Van Oostrum. Couldn't a focus on the regulation of big tech have many positive downstream effects on the background problems that society faces? It seems likely the former is strongly exacerbating the latter. Regulation isn't supposed to be a panacea, sure, but it should definitely be part of the solution. Jeremy, do you want to pick up those two questions?
So yeah, I'll quickly pick them up. So on the first point, business model is absolutely a part of the conversation that needs to happen, right? There, envisioning or imagining a world in which search technology is provided and enabled in a high quality way that doesn't depend on the harvesting of people's personal data and the selling of ads is possible. But of course, the antitrust debates that are unfolding in Europe and now in the United States are about the difficulty of offering consumers choice in that market when the secondary control of hardware and devices makes it impossible for a search platform that offers an alternative business model to even enter the conversation, a search model like Neeva or DuckDuckGo. But I don't think we can reduce it to business models, because the example that Rob gave earlier about end-to-end encrypted technology, right? The choice that's made by those who create WhatsApp and Signal to put their thumb on the scale for privacy to the exclusion of all sorts of other interests is not a business model issue. It's a question of how we referee the balancing of privacy and other concerns that we have and who should be making that decision. That's not a business model issue. On the broader point, and I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to respond to Helen's last comment, which is, the questioner said, shouldn't we use big tech as an arena, to basically begin to exercise our democratic muscles? And that's going to have knock-on effects down the road. And I guess I want to make sure that I'm properly understood in my comment on pragmatism, which is just to say, on the one hand, I'm an enthusiastic proponent of bold and ambitious ideas to challenge the core foundations of capitalism and the way in which democratic institutions work. And a lot of Helen's work, for example, takes a close look at lots of these experiments that are happening around the world and helps us understand that they're viable, meaningful exercises of democratic agency that challenge some of the core limitations of the existing models of the political institutions that we have. So I'm an enthusiastic proponent of that and have been both as a policymaker and a social scientist. At the same time, like Rob, I believe that democracy is an age-old technology, and it's an experiment in itself, and it's something that is dramatically evolving over time. You look back, it gets back to Bryce's comments about like, are we in a place where everything's on fire, or are we in a place where there are new problems that we need to confront? And if you think back over the American democratic experiment, there are lots of moments where you might have written the epitaph for democracy. Like given the fact that democracy didn't include most people in the United States for most of its existence. And so the reason that Rob and Mehran and I make a bet on that age-old process is that we've identified what we think is a core issue that technocracy and technology is bad at, which is refereeing value trade-offs among free and equal individuals who want to live together and don't agree with one another. And democracy is the best technology that the world has come up with for dealing with that particular problem. Can it be improved? Sure, it can be improved for all the reasons that Hélène described, but should, like the questioner said, we use those democratic muscles, however imperfect, to confront this next challenge in our policy and regulatory landscape? We absolutely should. And while we may believe that the problems are bigger than Bryce laid them out to be, I think we are fundamentally people who believe that, and I gave you examples for why we are as optimistic as we are, that existing institutions are beginning to be aware of the power that, the countervailing power that they can offer, and that we need to energize our fellow citizens to be informing and engaging that deliberative process.
Just want to add just a quick two finger on this to answer in a certain respect the question as directly as I can at the moment. So, in the diagnosis of the problem in the book in our presentation, we mentioned the third prong. It's not just the optimization mindset and the venture capitalist obsession with scale, but the deliberate regulatory indifference from Washington, D.C. and democratic institutions for 30 years. So to take stock of the problem of the business model, one thing we ought at least to try is put into place some off-the-shelf common ideas from a regulatory point of view to contain some of the harms. So just for example, if the ad-driven business model of many big tech companies, if that's your diagnosis as one of the core problems, steal a bunch of data, make a bunch of predictive insights, sell someone's information off to advertisers to power the whole thing. Well, as Paul Romer suggests, you just take it to try out a gradated tax on digital advertising revenue, so that the more that the revenue you get comes from digital advertising, the greater the tax rate on it, as a way of providing a common economic incentive to these companies to try out some new revenue strategies. Give a subscription model a try. Maybe as Signal exists, you take a bunch of money philanthropically and you implant the company within a nonprofit background structure that doesn't in the first place depend on revenue. So this is by no means an all things considered solution, but I just want to point out, we haven't even tried the basic things yet because Washington, D.C. has been asleep at the wheel for the past 30 years. It's time to try some basic approaches.
I'm conscious of the fact that Bryce and Vince have been quiet for too long, not down to their fault. So I want to give them a chance to say anything they want to say now, conscious of the fact that we're running out of time. Because I've got a killer question from Lily E to ask Mehran. I want to save time for that, but now's your chance, guys. So does anyone want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, I'm still curious about how exactly the regulation will work, and are we confident that Washington, D.C. or more generally government around the world is capable of doing that in a technical sense, but also in a political sense, right? Or do we really need some of Hélène's more radical solutions to this? It's not entirely clear to me at this point, right? But just saying that government needs to regulate more, maybe that's true, but exactly what will be the process that makes that work well? What is the role for people inside the companies? There are many people inside these companies that really care about these questions. and what role do we expect them to take? I think they're often in a kind of difficult situation that the company is still responsible to its shareholders, and yet they are the people who really know what's going on. There are many different models that you might propose, but I think the details of that are not easy to get right. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying, but yeah, that would be my comment.
Bryce, do you want to say anything?
I want to hear your killer question.
Okay, well, that's what I was hoping you'd say. All right, so the killer question from Lily E to Mehran. What can be recommended to current students and undergraduates that want to go into the sector of ethical and responsible use of AI? How can they get involved, and what can they do to help?
I think the first thing, and this is something Rob, Jeremy, and I had to do when we were coming together to teach our class, was to get out of your comfort zone, in the sense that students are likely to gravitate towards the things that they're comfortable with, that they feel good doing or they feel good at. And that oftentimes means they stay in a disciplinary silo. And part of getting out of your comfort zone is moving into other disciplines and understanding what they really have to offer, to be able to be intellectually humble, to realize that many other fields have thought about issues that in your field might be new, which was certainly the case for computer science, where now there's a lot of people who are thinking about issues in ethics and accountability and transparency that are issues that have been thought about in other fields for quite some time. And there's a rich literature there to be able to leverage and think about how it bears on your field. The other is the human connection, I think, is besides just the intellectual engagement that comes from studying different fields or looking at different perspectives, is actually the engagement with other people to be able to debate what you think are the important values, to come to your own conclusion about what matters, and then to take action based on it. And whether that action be, a level of getting directly involved in the political process, or being engagements and social activism with, colleagues and fellow students. But there's a way for all of us to get involved. And if you're a technologist, knowing that if you were to go into the technology sector, you actually wield a tremendous amount of power in terms of raising these conversations, talking about what is actually being optimized, what is worth optimizing, and raising the level of discourse within a company. But at the end of the day, we're all citizens. Hopefully, many of us are citizens of democracies, and so we can make our voice known through that process. And maybe someday, as Ellen mentioned, we'll have more radical ways of doing that as well.
That's a beautiful answer, I think, and it actually applies double to academics about the need to get out of their intellectual comfort zone. Ruth, is there anything you want to add at this point before we wrap up?
Maybe I can just muse out loud about the take-home message, at least that I'm getting from this wonderful session. So is the idea really that, sorry, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to phrase my take-home message with a kind of barb at the end, okay? So, there are all these problems with AI. They distort values. The wrong people are making the value trade-offs. The solution is to use democracy to provide us with guardrails. And that seems great to me. So what is democracy good for? What kind of guardrails can it provide? Well, we know from history, it's really good at preventing mass starvation, widespread poverty, constraining nuclear warheads. But the kinds of issues that I think you're talking about, and Jeremy, I wrote down something Jeremy said. He said, how do we get democracy to address the inequalities that many of us, the social harms that many of us care about? And I think that those guardrails are very substantive, robust guardrails, not like preventing starvation. And so the question is really whether democracy can do that. And if democracy can do that, then why not say, let AI run rampant? And then democracy will always step in to prevent, and then you fill in whatever the guardrails are, starvation, massive inequality, whatever. So we don't need democracy to play a role in making the trade-offs for AI. Let the engineers make the horrible trade-offs they do, and democracy will step in by providing guardrails. That's not quite the picture you want, and I wonder why that shouldn't be the take home?
That sounds like a volume 2 question now, but I just want to end by saying that the point that Mehran made, that there are these important issues that digital technology, AI, raises for us, and they really demand efforts at interdisciplinary engagement, which can be extremely difficult. They're difficult enough for students, but they're much harder for academics who are used to being experts in a very specific domain and not being challenged and not being in a situation of ignorance. And I think one of the great things about this book, it's a wonderful example of people with 3 different disciplinary backgrounds coming together to really tackle these really important issues of our time. So I just want to thank the 3 authors for being with us today and having this excellent discussion, and also to the commentators and to my co-chair, Ruth Chang. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you everyone for watching this. Thanks a lot and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming.